Over a century ago, a tomb ship bound for China is shipwrecked and sinks. The SS Ventnor has a ghostly cargo. The remains of 499 Chinese gold miners, all packed in coffins that never made it home. The ship still lies at the bottom of the ocean, somewhere off the coast of northern New Zealand. The ship's manifest goes down with the coffins, so the names of the miners are erased from history along with their bones. But the name of one man has been preserved, Choi Su Hoi, and it still calls to his family through time.
He is buried at the moment in a watery grave, and from Chinese superstition, that's not good.
Choi Su Hoi was my great-grandfather, and that's my greatest wish, that I could be able to do something to complete his journey home.
Choi Su Hoi was one of the first and greatest Chinese pioneers in New Zealand, and his name holds a rightful place among the founding fathers of modern New Zealand. Choi's remains were in one of the 499 coffins lost when the Ventnor sank off Hokianga on that fateful night more than a century ago. This is the journey of his modern-day Kiwi descendants to find a home for Choi Su Hoi's spirit and possibly his body. (1861), and the rush is on. Gold has been discovered in Otago's Gabriel's Gully, spurring a frenzy of gold fever felt the world over. Miners rush from Australia, the US, and Europe. But the Otago gold rush was over almost as soon as it had started. The quick men who came in search of easy riches fled.
At the end of that time, between 1861 and 1864, the gold rush had seen the departure of thousands of European miners, either going back to Victoria or going off to the West Coast gold rushes. And the population went down so quickly from about 19,000 European miners in early 1864 to 6,000 in late 1865.
What New Zealand needed was a new group of men willing to work harder for their riches. The invitation went out from the Otago Provincial Council for Chinese gold miners to come to New Zealand to work the available gold fields. One local who was attracted was a 30-year-old merchant, Choi Su Hoi.
Choi Su Hoi came from Punyu in Guangdong province, and it turned out that the earliest Chinese arrivals to Otago came from Upper Punyu. They had taken part in the Red Turban Rebellion. Their part of the county was devastated by the government revenge, so it was in a disturbed state and in a poor state, and they had to flee, and he came along with that first group, and they saw an opportunity in Otago.
When Choi Su Hoi arrived in Dunedin, the merchant in him immediately saw opportunity. He set up a general store in Stafford Street, Dunedin, to provide for the Chinese mining community.
They would come off the boat and make for his store, which was in Lower Stafford Street, just opposite the Rattray Street wharf.
He provided the Chinese provision, the gold mining equipments, like the gold panning and diggers and so on.
Choi Su Hoi's store became a mecca for the Chinese miners in Otago.
He wasn't actually a gold miner himself, he was a businessman as a merchant, and he actually supplied the gold miners and helped them with a lot of their affairs. And how he did that was, he was probably a lot smarter, but he knew English. And that was his key to being able to do business, also to translate for the gold miners and do all those sorts of affairs.
Equally, if not of prime importance, was that he had the resources to give miners equipment and food to tide them over their initial state before they were earning well. And he would receive them, give them advice, break them into parties, give them initial clothing, and get them away inland.
It was into forbidding hills like these in the Kawerau Gorge, more than 200 kilometers inland from Dunedin, that the Chinese miners had to trek, often on foot, to search for gold. Duncan Su Hoi and his son Peter are retracing their steps. They're heading for one of the old camps in the Kawerau Gorge to discover just how tough life was for the Chinese miners as they dug for gold in this remote hinterland. Historian Les Wong is an expert on the Chinese miners' experience in New Zealand.
Hello, Les. How are you?
Welcome.
Here?
Yes. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
The miners built their huts out of schist rocks that they found in the riverbeds.
They brought the rocks up from the river. After the gold had been washed, the rocks were clean and they put it together. Often when goods came from Dunedin, they were wrapped in sacking from the Suhoi stores. So that sacking was then reused again for insulation on the huts.
It's a good idea.
What other supplies would the gold miners have got from him?
They brought mainly dried foods. There was Chinese food like rice, dried fish, dried plums, ginger, and there was even liniment and ointment that they could use when they got hurt. But other than that, there was no medical service and only herbs that they could use to ease their pain from the hardship that they had on the goldfields.
It would take 2 weeks for the Suhoi's horse and cart to get up here from Dunedin with supplies. And for those Chinese miners who had to trek here on foot, it would take a month of hard walking. It was back-breaking work getting at the gold. Shoveling sand into sluices. Separating the tiny grains of gold embedded in the quartz rocks. It wasn't only the work itself that was challenging. The central Otago climate was unforgiving. In summer, they could be cooking out here alive in 36-degree heat, and in winter, the opposite extreme, with temperatures dropping to as low as 20 below. Sickness was a constant companion.
Those who were so sick got left behind as the others moved on, because taking them with them would have been a burden. And they starved to death and died a very lonely death.
Despite the hardships on the goldfields, nobody prospered as much as the men who supplied the miners.
Hoi Hoi was a top merchant in Dunedin, acknowledged by Europeans and Chinese alike. When they reacted against the Chinese later on, they were called Celestials and Mongolians and that kind of name, but it was always Mr. Silhoi.
He married a European woman, Eliza Prescott, and had 2 children with her. He also invested in gold mining, buying and operating 2 gold dredges.
Choi Silhoi had about a dozen mining ventures, and he had 2 quartz mines, for example. Then he had sluicing ventures, of which the one at Nokamai was a top public company in New Zealand for sluicing for several years.
Off the back of the gold miners and the mechanization that Choi Su-hoi introduced, Dunedin grew to become one of the wealthiest cities in the Southern Hemisphere. The grand buildings that line its streets today are all in part the result of Choi Soo-hoi's business acumen and vision.
He, of all people, would have been the closest Chinese person in Otago to joining the European elites.
Generosity and tradition was at the heart of Choi Soo-hoi's business model. In 1882, as the leader of the Chinese community in Otago, he founded a charitable society, the Chong Sing Tong, to assist the gold miners with their spiritual needs.
Really, it was an insurance policy for the Chinese gold miners. Should they pass away in New Zealand, then there was money available for their remains to be exhumed, for the remains to be shipped back to China and reburied in their home villages.
Duncan Soo-hoi still has some of the original society donation letters sent by gold miners to his great-grandfather's store.
This is a letter dated the 19th of July, 1882, sent in by one of the Chinese gold miners from Central Otago, Lawrence, to Soo-hoi, enclosing £7.50. This is another letter sent to Soo-hoi in 1882. In the letter, there is £3 sent into the Chong Sing Tong Benevolent Society, and from the miner called Yip Man, and this came from Central Otago mining area.
In 1883, the Society successfully arranged for the shipment of 230 bodies from New Zealand back to China. In 1901, Choi Soo-hoi began arranging for a second shipment of Chinese miners' bodies back to their homeland. Some of the Chinese graves dug up were from here, in Dunedin's Southern Cemetery.
There were over 40 cemeteries right throughout the country where they were exhumed from. The bulk of them were around the Otago and West Coast area. They began exhumations in early 1901 and they concluded towards the end of 1902.
The Europeans at the time must have been horrified to hear of what the Chinese wanted to do, to dig up the remains of their fellow countrymen and take them back to China to get reburied. How did they get permission to do that?
Everybody in New Zealand knew about it, and they just did not like it. They were horrified. They were petitioning against the Chinese carrying out this practice. But the health department said that they had issued a permit for the Chinese to go ahead and do this particular task.
I heard from my family mentioned that the bodies from the graves around here were sent into my great-grandfather Choi Soo-hoi's farm in Otago Valley.
Yes, your father's quite right. It was a very unpleasant process. Bones were individually washed, and each bone was counted, and the small bones were put into individual wrappings of calico. The bigger bones were put into a larger calico bag, and they were all put together. And from that, they actually put the name of the person inside the bag, and the bag was tied. Then the bag was put into a coffin, and they were stacked in the sheds, and they were stored there until all the coffins were ready to be shipped.
Digging up the bodies for the second shipment was disrupted when Choi Soo-hoi died suddenly in July 1901, just a year before the second shipment was due to set sail back to China. As a respected city leader, Choi Soo-hoi was given a prominent burial here in Dunedin's Southern Cemetery. His death was a major setback for the Chong Sing Tong Society's body repatriation plans, into which stepped his son, Choi Kum Poi, who took over running both the society and the shipment. The SS Ventnor, with its cargo of 499 coffins, set to sea from Wellington bound for Hong Kong on the 26th of October 1902. Choi Su-hoi's body now was also part of the cargo.
Most of the coffins were stowed below. The ship was refitted to take those Chinese coffins together with the Chinese who were supervising the voyage as well. So there were live Chinese accompanying their ancestors back to China.
The Chinese remains on their last great journey home were never to make it.
The ship struck rocks on the west coast of the North Island of New Zealand, approximately halfway up the island. The ship was far too close to the coast. The sea conditions were good, and the coast was pretty well lit. It shouldn't have happened.
The captain reversed the vessel and got off the rocks. But instead of limping to the nearby port of New Plymouth, he made a fateful decision.
The captain decided that the damage wasn't as severe as they thought, and they thought they could actually make it up to Auckland. But unfortunately, damage was severe, and they took on water and the boat sank off the Hokianga heads. I believe it's 10 miles out in, I think, 150 metres of water, so it's in a very, very deep place.
"499 coffins sank to the ocean floor, a tragedy of such immensity and consequence that an official board of inquiry was convened.
3 boats got off the Ventnor safely with most of the crew and passengers. The 4th did not. No one survived from that boat. That was the one with the master. So he was carrying on the traditions of the British merchant marine by being one of the last off the ship itself.
13 men perished when the Ventnor sank, including 5 elderly Chinese attendants who had been given free passage home by the Chong Sing Tong Society in exchange for looking after the coffins on board.
The official court of inquiry was clearly a little bit frustrated. It identified the main cause, which was very obvious: navigational error, incompetence. There was some debate about whether booze had contributed to that. The officers stood by the master and said, no sign of drinking. Many, but not all of the crew, said yes, he was known to take a drop. We could smell it on him. He was red-faced on the day. So they probably decided, seeing he was dead in this, the way of the day, not to cancel his certificate and keep his name clear.
The Chinese community in New Zealand were devastated by the Ventnor's sinking. It was especially harrowing news for Dunedin restaurateur Duncan Su-hoi's family at the time. They'd lost their elder Choi Su-hoi, whose coffin had gone down with the ship.
For our family, that was really sad. And then my great-uncle chartered vessels to come here to look for the body, look for the coffins.
Choi's son, Kum Poi, immediately initiated a search for the stricken vessel.
When he heard of the Ventnor sinking, my great-uncle was obviously devastated. The society immediately chartered another boat, I think it's called a steamer called Energy, to come down to this area and search for any remains or any of the coffins that may be floating.
My great-uncle was crying, saying, my poor father died twice.
It was, in a sense, a second death for these people. The Chinese believe that human remains should be buried. A watery death or submergence is a second death.
中国人有这样的传统的，就是他要死以后啊，要入土为安呐，要安葬在自己的家乡。
The sinking of the Ventnor still resonates with the Su-hoi family today. They had lost their family leader for good to the sea, and his watery grave was a doubly bad resting place in Chinese belief systems. Here in Dunedin's Chinese gardens, a memorial to the Chinese gold miners' contribution to the early history of Otago. Duncan and Peter Suhoi know just how important it is spiritually to the Chinese that their dead be buried back in their homeland.
This is especially important for the Chinese as the living descendants can tend to the graves of their descendants to ensure a good afterlife for the deceased, but also ensure success for the living descendants.
The wreck of the SS Ventnor has never been officially located. It still lies in its watery grave, thought to be 10 miles off Hokianga harbour in 160 metres of water, one of the deepest wrecks in New Zealand's maritime history. In the months after the Ventnor sank in October 1902, a bag containing several bones washed ashore at Mitimiti, north of Hokianga harbour. Peter's taking the 4.5 hours drive north from Auckland to discover what happened to those remains that washed up on the land of the Te Rarawa tribe.
I'm off to meet one of the elders, Mingo. He's going to tell me the story of what his ancestors did when they discovered the bones and buried the bones. I'm really excited to hear his stories.
Peter is given a traditional welcome onto the marae at Mitimiti to meet tribal elder Mingo Martin.
Haere mai ki te karanga o tō tātou tūpuna e. Haere mai, haere mai. Haere mai te koro wai aroha. Haere mai, haere mai.
Uncle Mingo, thank you for welcoming me back onto your marae.
Kia ora.
Can I just ask you just a few questions about the Ventnor that sunk and the bones that washed up onto your beaches? Can you tell me how they were found and what happened to the bones?
There was no roads in those days, and the beach was the main highway. And of course, they used to pick up from about 5 k's down the beach there, pick up all the cream. They would bring all their cream cans down to the beach, and this particular morning they were going up, picking up their cans, and they found these bags on the beach. So he picked one up, opened it, had a look in it, and so it was just bones. So he had no idea what was going on, where these bones came from. So they buried them in the cemetery in Rawane, which was not a Maori cemetery, but a Pākehā cemetery.
One very, very good thing that's come out of it, it's brought the local Maori, who've found the bones, and the Chinese together.
We respect you as people. We respect your culture. We respect your custom. It doesn't matter who they are, what colour they were. A person who's deceased is a person who's deceased, and they always respected the deceased. But we have a saying, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. It is a person, it is a person, it is a person. We are like Chinese. I mean, we have this kopa, as you call it. When our dead die, we assume, like the Chinese, if you don't go back to China, you know your spirit doesn't reach Te Ira Wairua, which is the spiritual world.
That a small number of the miners have a final resting place on dry land and are respected in a similar way by the Maori people is heartening to the Suhoi family. But with his curiosity fired up, Peter learns that remains floated ashore months later south of Hokianga harbour in the lands of the Te Roroa tribe.
One of my elders made me aware of the existence of some burials in the sandhills here of the remains of Chinese gold miners. The general locale is known, but not the precise site or the precise position where the interments occurred, but the documented record states that there were 33 coffins washed up here. The local iwi, or my family basically, would have been very surprised to find those things on the beach. They would have very quickly undergone some sort of ritual process and interred them where they washed up. They would have had no idea where they had come from, and so the thing would have been to bury them quickly.
What is remarkable is that the Te Roroa people took it upon themselves to bury strangers not of their tribe on their own sacred land.
They would have been obligated to deal with the remains in the way, in the fashion that they were accustomed to. That would be being respectful. The whole process of reinterring them, I think, was, I would have thought, common to humanity, not just Maori or our people.
111 years after the tragic sinking of the Ventnor, the Te Roroa tribe invite more than 100 members of the Chinese community onto their marae to honour their ancestors' passing. As rain begins to gently fall, 36 members of the Suhoi family are present for this special day of commemoration. Some of them pilgrims from as far afield as Hong Kong and Australia.
Welcome everybody into our beautiful marae that God has made for us today. We have our Wairua, the spirit of our ancestors and your ancestors. They're all up there, they're all looking down, and they're probably saying, it's about time you fellas turned up. It's been over 100 years. And for the one day that we could have picked to come here and do this special commemoration to those people who were tragically lost to us out here in the ocean, we couldn't have picked a better day. Here they are crying on us. I know you believe that too, that these are the tears of our ancestors that are raining down on us now. And of course, your culture, exactly the same as ours, wants to repatriate them back home. We call it the Ukaipo, where they were actually born, and we wanted to take them back home, just like you people were.
He wahi kāinga, he wahi tāpū, I te nehe nui o Waipaua. He pū ke tirohanga pā, waka tūtū, tiro atu, tiro mai, huri noa e. Tiakina mai e, nei taonga no te ao, ko hatu e.
I think most of the Chinese people are here today to extend their thanks to our cousins. By cousins, I mean the local Maori people. After the tragedy of SS Ventnor, some bones of the 499 bodies were washed upshore, and the local Maori people found them and buried them here. I sincerely thank the Maori people, our cousins, for the noble deeds in helping the Chinese community.
It was just such an emotional experience for us to be up here, to speak to the descendants of the Maori that actually buried the remains and have cared for the remains all these years. I could see that it was a relief for them to see us, and they did make mention of why did it take so long.
Oh, tremendous. Feeling very emotional, excited, and felt the warmth and generosity from the tribes. We have 3 generations here with me to pay respect to my great-grandfather, and somewhere I think he would probably feel very humble and very honored or very pleased that we are here, able to be here together.
We chose this time because it's the Qingming Festival. The Qingming Festival is also called Ancestors' Day or Tomb Sweeping Day, It's a day where families get together and come to the grave sites and the cemeteries to clean the stones and the sites, but mainly to spend time and pay respects to the ancestors. With Choi Su Hoi, it's the first Qingming ever that the family have been able to come to where Choi Su Hoi actually lies. They bring offerings, they bring food, chicken, pork buns, Chinese tea and wine to offer it to the ancestors. They also offer money, they burn money so that their ancestors can have these up there in heaven. So that ensures a good afterlife for our ancestors and in turn prosperity for their living descendants. They want us back every year anyway to celebrate Qingming, and they're very happy to see us because it's important for them to tend to their deceased just as it is important for us.
The Chinese visitors unveiled a plaque in a forest grove on the marae to thank the Te Roroa tribe for respecting and caring for their ancestors' remains.
This is just another step for relationships between our Maori people and the Chinese people. It's taken over 100 years, but it's been done. They weren't forgotten, and you can imagine yourself, even in the human form, when things have been put right and done in that proper way, you too will shed tears, you know. Can't help it. So, yeah, it's huge. The spiritual side is huge in a thing like this.
With the knowledge that some of their countrymen made it ashore and have found a safe and caring resting place, Peter and Duncan Su Hoi now have a vision. Can the rest of the miners and their family patriarch, Choi Su Hoi, also be rescued and perhaps returned to China? Peter Su Hoi meets with the former Minister of Maori Affairs, Peter Sharples, and the Chinese consul in New Zealand, Liu Xingbao, to discuss the Ventnor sinking.
And we have a saying, only when one is buried in the earth, he or she can rest in peace.
Yeah,
well,
same.
Until he's buried, even though he's dead, he's like a ghost wandering around without home. A burial is his or her home forever.
That's exactly the same as Maori. You know, the other thing is to locate them in their own area. So when I die, my tribe will come and get me, or I'll haunt them for 100 years.
I think with the Ventnor tragedy, it's the inability of the living descendants in China to actually have the remains go back and be buried so that they can worship their ancestors, so that the ancestors can have a good afterlife and also bring good fortune to the living descendants. I think that's more with the tragedy.
Well, see, you've just described what it is like for Maori people who cannot get their dead, if you like, back home and buried in the proper way, in the proper place. They feel exactly like that.
Yes.
Duncan Su Hoi's dream is that the Ventnor is located and salvaged so the Chinese remains can be returned home.
I wish and be part of my family honor to be able to complete his journey home.
The New Zealand Navy has offered the services of its dive ship, the HMNZ Manawanui, to dive for and locate the wreck of the SS Ventnor. It is standing by for suitable weather conditions to complete the mission. Until that day comes, Duncan Su Hoi, great-grandson of Choi Su Hoi, has one other important journey to complete. He will close the circle and make the ancestral journey back to Guangdong that Choi Su-hoi never got to complete.
I'm really very excited that I can start going back on the route, and my wish was to complete the journey home. Now I am going that route.
Finally, Duncan's off to China, heading for Guangzhou to commemorate with his Chinese relatives his revered ancestor's life.
Wow, we finally arrived in China, in Guangzhou. Marvelous.
He's taking with him his son Peter and daughter-in-law Janice to share the experience. Guangzhou today is a bustling, dynamic metropolis of almost 40 million people. Located on the Pearl River 120 kilometers north of Hong Kong, Guangzhou is China's most populous city. When Duncan was born in the 1930s, Guangzhou's population was just a little over 200,000 people. A very different world.
The changes in Guangzhou is massive. The economy is thriving. 30 years ago, the streets were full of bikes. Now, everyone has a car. It's incredible how the city and the people's lives have transformed and grown.
Duncan emigrated to New Zealand when he was 12 years old in 1946.
This is the meat. Oh, seahorse. Seahorse is for seahorse.
It's really important to me that I'm accompanying my father back to the village for the very first time to meet some of our family, but more importantly, pay respect to our ancestors.
I can see huge changes since the 70 years when I first traveled along this narrow gravel road in 1944 under the Japanese occupation. There were rice and vegetable fields stretching far and wide on both sides of this road.
Today, rice is still being harvested in the fields outside the village. The urban expansion is fast approaching.
Now, in 2014, I see many large farming areas have disappeared to make room for bigger villages and townships. Buildings and bikes and cars are now everywhere, eating into the countryside. I miss the clean, fresh country air, the buffaloes working in the rice fields, and the blue sky.
The Su-hois have arrived in their ancestral village of Sha Kung, the birthplace of Duncan's great-grandfather, Choi Su-hoi.
The children of the Su-hoi family all around this area.
Duncan and his family's pilgrimage to their ancestral village is a time for reflection, but also one of celebration. Tonight, the Su-hois are hosting a special dinner for over 200 of their relatives from the village to mark their return and to thank them all for their support over the years. It was a chance to pull out the family tree and to rejoice in their family connections.
I had to use a family tree book to write them to which generation and how we are related. And this is very exciting. All our members of the families, they say, oh, I'm so-and-so. Some of them I have to call you grand-uncle and call you now cousin and this and that.
food was really delicious, especially the suckling piglets. It was good.
Over 10 dishes, especially make us very happy to see so many relatives that we have not even met before. And this is very exciting.
And I'm really overwhelmed as well to see so many relatives that live in the village that I don't know. And if I've got an opportunity tonight, we'll go around and meet some more of them.
Along with renewed connections, it's time to finally visit Choi Su Hoi's original village home.
So generous.
Yes.
With the money.
Here we are, finally arriving at our grandfather's house. And I realized my dream is becoming true. And this is the one that is the one that I've been great-grandfather Siu was born here. I've been through here in my younger days, and this is it. I'm very emotional.
Okay, that's okay. So we've got cousin Wayne and cousin Mike from Guangdong to show us through the house. So I'm just going to knock on the door and we'll see if they're there.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, hi Wayne.
Oh,
how are
yeah.
you?
Welcome.
Michael, good to see you. Michael, almost in tears. It's finally coming in now, and my dream is almost at the end now, realizing it.
No, that's
beautiful.
You have been here. Let me show you your own home, okay? And this house is lived in by the Siu Hoi, Charles Siu Hoi, in the 1860s, before he went to Australia and New Zealand digging up gold. This part is lived by his family and also his first and second cousin living the other side. And inside, there's a sort of a lounge. You come in here. Okay, we sleep here. This is the original house.
Yes. Is this the first
house? The first house of Siu Hoi built. Yeah. So I think this why it's so important, for the family.
Yeah.
Up there, there's still some of our ancestor ashes stored in the cabinet up there.
So are there still some ashes in those three vases?
Yeah, you can see that on the top corner, and of course it's much higher.
Coming into the Siu Hoi's house and seeing, open the door, that I was so emotional that I felt tears of joy. I was really happy to show Peter and Janice. At last, I could see my dream come true.
The culmination of Duncan and his family's journey has dawned. More than 40 of their Chinese relatives have arrived at Choi Su Hoi's Chinese gravesite to honour him in a Bai San ceremony. For Duncan, Peter and Janice, it is a momentous occasion.
Nice to see you all here. Thank you.
It's been a long, long journey. We've been in Dunedin, we've been to Hokianga, and now here. It's amazing to come here. I think he'd be so happy with all the offerings that we've given him and just us being here.
Knowing that Choi Su Hoi's body was unlikely to ever return home, his Chinese relatives used a spiritual leader to lure his spirit into a funeral jar. That jar is buried here, in his Chinese grave. After a century of worry, it may be that Choi Su Hoi's spirit has been at rest all along, safe in the care of his family.
Great-great-grandfather, I'm Peter and this is my wife Janice. We've flown thousands of miles from all the way from New Zealand to be here today. We pay honour to you we're here to pay our respects to you. Thank you for coming to New Zealand all those years and years ago. Had you not come to New Zealand, I would not be here today. Rest in peace.
Great-granddad, I am your great-grandson, Duncan, from New Zealand. I am 80 years old now. This is my first time to come here to pay respect to you. Knowing that my dream to bring you home and your Ventnor friends home to China and to lay you here in peace forever. I feel so honored, so proud, and so emotional. I can't hold back my tears of happiness.
At last, Duncan's journey is over. He's returned to his great-grandfather's ancestral village and paid homage to the great man and his legacy. Duncan's ultimate wish is that one day he will stand here on the banks of the Pearl River in Guangdong, along with 5,000 members of his extended family from all around the world, all dressed in white, and welcome home Choi Su-hoi's body to the land of his birth and lay him to rest forever.